Hey everybody, today I just want to do a quick video on securing your web services and web communications in LabVIEW. So LabVIEW has obviously the HTTP client methods that ship with LabVIEW that you can use. There's a few different toolkits on VIPM as well. And then you also have LabVIEW web services, which you can leverage for creating like the other end of that communication in LabVIEW. So I'm going to talk about the do's and don'ts and what to be aware of when you are using these things in LabVIEW. So first, let's talk about the HTTP client functions. These are not crazy complicated security-wise, right? A lot of the security of them is handled for you out of the box. So HTTP client VIs automatically provide encryption under the hood when you use an HTTPS URL. So, if you're using like a GET, for example, right, and I pass in an HTTPS URL, it's automatically going to try to use the certificates in my certificate store for encrypted communication back and forth to the devices. So that's pretty much handled for you out of the box. You just need to make sure that you're using the S there for obviously whatever you're talking to has to support the S side of it. But provided they do, you just want to make sure that you're using that URL. And it's all handled for you pretty much out of the box. You don't even have to think about it. So when using a REST API or any other HTTP-based protocol like WebSockets, you don't have to manually implement encryption, although you should ensure that HTTPS is being used. And you can also add additional security to these. So this is like things like access tokens, logins, OAuth, etc. So obviously this is kind of a function of whatever you're talking to, right? Just because you want more security doesn't mean you can just now add an access token if the thing you're talking to doesn't use access tokens. So whatever your HTTP client is talking to needs to allow different things like either logins or access tokens. OAuth is kind of a totally separate thing, but it also is a great way to implement security here. I mean, if the web server you're talking to supports these things, you want to make sure that you're using them. Now on web services. So LabVIEW web services provide a simple way to generate REST endpoints. And by default, these are all HTTP unencrypted endpoints. So basically what you get out of the box is minimum security. You can implement better security by setting up authorization methods. So either logins by users or access tokens. And then depending on your hosting option, so NI web server, application web server, system link server, you're going to have different options for configuring that. So this depends now where you host it. You kind of can host it either in the NI web server, which is what you should be using if you're worried about security. It's the modern one. Uses the most modern practices. It's based on Apache web server. So in terms of like security performance, it's the ideal one to use. Application web server is considered legacy, but it still works and you still can secure it as well. And then system link server you can also use to host your web applications, which I believe just under the hood uses NI web server. TLS encryption is available with both NI web server and application web server, although the implementation is far more manual with the application web server. So when you're setting up your NI web server, it's actually really simple to set up. You can just pull up there's like a GUI once you've installed the NI web server, and you can go create like admin credentials, and then from there configure what security options you want for your NI web server. You can add like certificates and keys and stuff to it so that it uses certain certificates for encryption, and you can configure different policies, different user accounts if you want to create user accounts, etc. And if you're tying this into a web interface, right, you also need to configure proper security and authentication for the web app. So if you're using gweb to create like a web page and you're hosting that in your NI web server or application web server, you want to make sure that whatever you're doing in that web application is also secure. So yeah, let's talk about a little bit about setting up the NI web server. So when deploying a web server, the NI web server is recommended as it has built-in best practices including encryption, authentication, course control, certification. So when you're configuring the web server, it gives you a couple of just generic kind of default options, right? You're going to want to select secure remote access. So that's the one you pretty much always want to use, unless maybe you're just testing something locally and you're not really worried about it. You could just set it to simple local access. But for pretty much anything else, you really should be using secure remote access. So CORS is disabled by default and almost always should remain like that. If you need to allow it, you can configure a list of certain origins or trusted web servers that can access it. Don't just allow anything. But yeah, ideally, right, you just want to leave CORS disabled. Deploying web servers to embedded targets should always be taken into consideration, just because they can be easily overwhelmed because they have limited resources. So, right, one of the things with web services is they're always kind of listening for data coming in, right? That's kind of the point of a web service, right? It's just listening for connections coming in and it responds to those connections. Well, someone can just spam it with, hundreds, thousands of connections, and it can make the device go unresponsive, which potentially could cause machine failures, crashes, stuff like that. So just want you to be aware of that if you're deploying these to RT targets. Just make sure that, if something goes wrong, as you connect this to the internet, right, all sorts of things can it just opens your attack surface up so much. So you just want to make sure you take that into consideration. If you're deploying this to like an intranet, like your local network, obviously there's a lot less security concerns there, at least in terms of getting like DDoS attacked or something, right? Not that it's impossible, but it's a lot less likely than if you're just connected to the public internet. But so yeah, just one thing, be aware of if you're doing that. You definitely don't want to set yourself up in a scenario where someone can either take over your device or just cause it to malfunction or become unresponsive. So yeah, if you're using application web server, again, this is the kind of legacy one. It still works. You can still use encryption with it, etc. I would say best practice is to create an API key for your endpoints. So kind of here you have the web service properties. You can look at like all of your methods in those web services, and you can actually require an API key. That way you can create API keys for all your endpoints, and that way rather than just allowing anything, right, it requires one more level of authentication that this user does have the valid API key as well, so now I can respond to their request instead of just rejecting it. So yeah, that's kind of a crash course on using web services and the HTTP functions securely in LabVIEW. Hopefully that was helpful, and thanks for watching.
Canon Controls is your gateway to mastering LabVIEW. Dive into programming for data acquisition, industrial communications, and manufacturing automation. Explore how to enhance your projects with cybersecurity best practices. Join the journey to elevate your skills and secure your systems with every episode.